Well, good day, everyone. My name is Christina Louie, and I serve at Regent College as the Alumni and Church Involvement Officer. And I'm so glad to be with you today and to introduce the first of a new lecture series that Regent College is hosting called Reading the Bible Right Now. In this series, we are welcoming Bible scholars and theologians to personally reflect on how they are reading the Bible during the season of uncertainty. They'll share with us in response to questions such as, where in Scripture do you find hope, encouragement, rebuke, or a prophetic word? How does your rootedness in the Bible prepare you to engage with the issues of our day? And how does our reading of Scripture help us to read our cultural moment and vice versa? And today, I'm super excited to have Dr. Carmen Joy Imes with us. She will share her reflections on slavery at Sinai, wrestling with slavery laws in the Old Testament. Welcome, Carmen.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm so glad to have you here. Now, throughout Dr. Imes's talk, you, our live stream audience, are welcome to send us questions. You can send those questions to the email address questions@regent-college.edu. And that email address will pop up on your screen periodically as well to remind you of that option. Carmen will then respond to as many of your questions as we can fit in after her talk. And then we'll close our time just before 1 o'clock Pacific time. So I'd like to formally introduce you now to our speaker. Dr. Carmen Joy Imes is Professor of Old Testament at Prairie College in Three Hills, Alberta. And her books include Bearing Yahweh's Name at Sinai, a re-examination of the name command in the Decalogue, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, and Reading the Psalms with Augustine and Friends. She is currently writing a commentary on Exodus and a book on what it means to be the image of God, as well as study notes for 3 new study Bibles. So she's thinking an awful lot about what lay people notice when they read the biblical text. So we're so grateful for that work that you're doing, Carmen. She also blogs regularly on her own blog, carmenjoyimes.blogspot.com. And for Christianity Today and The Well, she also releases weekly Torah Tuesday videos on her YouTube channel. These are short little videos digging into a little bit of scripture, and I've just watched a bunch of them and they're great. So I would highly recommend them. Finally, if you want to dig deeper with Dr. Imes, she'll be teaching a course on Exodus for Regent College's 2021 summer programs, and all of that will be available online as well. So without further ado, I will turn things over to you, Carmen. Thank you.
Thank you. So delighted to be with you today. And for all those of you who are watching, thanks for joining us. I know you have other options on a historic day such as this. So I'm glad to have you together to think together about this important topic. It is Inauguration Day in the United States, and politics are on everyone's mind. For the second time in US history, a person of color will serve in one of the 2 most powerful offices. And for the first time in US history, a woman will be vice president. I think it's fair to say that the past 4 years were difficult for people of color in the United States. In just 1 year, we have witnessed the violent killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, each at the hands of current or former members of law enforcement. Sadly, these deaths were not an aberration, but reflect a long history of racial injustice in the United States. However, the outgoing administration seemed unable to heal the wounds of injustice, but instead fueled the fire. Just this morning, before boarding Air Force One for the last time, outgoing President Trump again referred to COVID-19 as, quote, the Chinese virus, end quote, further alienating Asians and Asian Americans. Given that 80% of white American evangelicals supported President Trump, it is fair to ask, is Christianity good news for people of color? As an Old Testament scholar, I felt this question pressing down on me with urgency this past May. In the wake of George Floyd's ruthless murder, I was working through slavery laws in Exodus, asking myself, is the Bible good news for slaves? Given America's history, is the Bible good news for Blacks? I wrestled with the apparent hypocrisy of a God who would rescue his people from slavery in Egypt, only to seemingly sanction it for his new nation. Cheryl Kirk-Duggan voices what bothers many people about the Old Testament when she says that, quote, slavery was bad for the Israelites to experience, but acceptable for them to initiate and practice, end quote. This apparent hypocrisy raises vexing ethical questions. So focusing on Exodus 21, my study sought to understand how laws on slavery functioned in ancient Israel and how they might function today as a source for ethical reflection. As Christina mentioned, I am the author of a book entitled Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. So it very much is on my mind to be able to make the case for why Sinai and how Sinai still matters, even the laws that we would rather forget about. The instructions at Sinai address God's people against the backdrop of their own slavery. So reading law in the shadow of Sinai means reading it as a call to freedom for every member of the covenant community. As you may be aware, the 10 Commandments begin with an announcement: I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out from the house of slavery. And so whatever follows in these laws, they must somehow be consistent with God's redeeming and rescuing and liberating work. But the book of the covenant, Exodus chapters 21 to 23, not only includes laws on slavery, it leads off with this topic, underscoring its priority for the covenant community. So first, a bit of background, and we can gather this just from reading extensively in the laws of the Torah. There's two main categories of servitude that existed in Israelite society, that involving fellow Hebrews and that involving foreigners. And while the rest of the book of the covenant puts constraints on both of these categories, Exodus 21 verses 2 through 11 only addresses Hebrew indentured servants. Hebrew people apparently entered into service in one of two ways. Either they became destitute so that they had no other choice but to pay their debts through indentured service, or they stole the property of a fellow Israelite and had no means of paying them back. Poverty is the impetus in both cases. Exodus 22 verse 3 indicates that an impoverished person has no license to steal. So if Israelite society functioned as designed, safety nets were in place to prevent destitution. The poor could harvest fallow fields or glean behind harvesters, and they could accept interest-free loans from those with the means to offer them. Regular debt relief was available on Sabbath years and the year of Jubilee. Clearly then, servitude was not an ideal scenario, but one resulting from the most desperate of situations. So for those rare situations, the Book of the Covenant put many guardrails in place in order to ensure a just society that promoted human flourishing. So that's where we're headed. What I want to do here is make the case that the slavery laws that seem so egregious to us when we first look at them are actually the means of grace and the means of helping those who have fallen on hard times, and at the same time constraining the power of those with means in society. It's worth noting that the entire book of Exodus up to this point has been framed in terms of service. The Hebrew people served Pharaoh in Egypt, and then Yahweh sent Moses to petition Pharaoh for leave so that the people could serve Yahweh instead in the wilderness. The entire goal of the Exodus event was a reversal of servitude, from serving Pharaoh to serving Yahweh. Faithfulness to the Sinai covenant would ensure that Israel would not become another Egypt. Any service of one human to another cannot contradict this reversal by instituting an Egyptian form of oppression or by preventing anyone from serving Yahweh. So our key passage, Exodus 21 verses 2 through 11, divides neatly into two parts. Although both sections deal with Hebrew servitude rather than enslavement of foreigners, their aims are different. So let's first consider the case or the situation of the male Eved. This is the Hebrew word used there, often translated slave, sometimes servant. I'm going to leave it untranslated so that we can make up our own minds about what it entails. If you hire a Hebrew Eved, 6 years he shall serve, but in the 7th he may leave freely at no cost. If he came alone, he shall leave alone. If he possessed a wife, his wife may leave with him. If his master gave him a wife and she bore him sons or daughters, the woman and her offspring will belong to her master, and he must leave alone. But if the servant insists, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or to the door frame, so that his master may pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. So here's a recap. The Eved is a hired worker who comes voluntarily. He serves for a limited number of years, and he leaves freely. No human is being trafficked here. The man sells his own services. He may be single or married, and he may elect to marry during his time of service. He may also elect to serve his master permanently, but that is up to him. I've already discussed the reasons that might result in this kind of contractual arrangement, either destitution or theft. In either case, the master provides a means of working off debt. These laws regulate such contractual arrangements so that the exploitation of labor is less likely to occur. Of course, a master could disregard these laws and be a horrible master, but he would do so at great risk to himself. The regulations were divine command embedded in a covenant for which the penalty for violation was severe. Those who disregarded the plight of the vulnerable incurred God's wrath. Covenant law is not a reinstitution of Egyptian servitude, now imposed on other people. What this passage describes is a far cry from the generalized servitude of the entire nation in Egypt, where the labor of every resident belonged to Pharaoh and could be exploited at will for his personal benefit. The laws in Exodus 21 only involve elective service. Male Hebrew servants are not captured, but enter willingly into limited contracts, likely motivated by severe financial duress. These laws seek to limit its implementation to protect the vulnerable from exploitation by the powerful. So that's the case of the male Eved. But let's be honest, it's the next part of this chapter that is most concerning. Verses 7 to 11 describe the case of the female Amma. It's a different word in Hebrew, and again, her circumstances are different. So let's read it together. But if a man sells his daughter as an Amma, she shall not leave as the male servants leave. If she is troublesome in the eyes of her master who has claimed her for himself, then he must let her be ransomed. He's not allowed to sell her to foreign people because he broke the agreement with her. But if he has claimed her for his son, he must treat her in accordance with daughter's rights. If he takes another wife for himself, he may not reduce her food, clothing, or marital rights. But if he does not give her these three, then she may leave without paying any money. The troubling implications of this text are many. Why is a man selling his daughter? Is she considered property? Why is she not allowed to go free as the male Eved? And why would her master take another wife? The role of an Amma in the ancient household often, or maybe always, included marriage, and that seems evident from this passage. The rules regulating female servitude reflect that. And we have a few clues in the passage. If I go back to the previous slide, we see it's a man who has claimed her for himself. So she is his personal Amma, which implies that he is married to her, and he's not allowed to sell her because they've made an agreement together. But the other possibility is that he has acquired her in order to marry his son. If he's claimed her for his son, then this is how he is to treat her. And if he takes another for himself, then there are certain rights that she retains. So it seems clear from these clues that an Amma marries into the household. So her situation is different from the Eved, the male Eved. It's worth noting that fathers in this period of time in this part of the world always arranged marriages for their daughters, and those marriages typically included a mohar or bride price given to the bride's family from the groom. So although sell is an unfortunate translation, I haven't thought of a good way around it. This is not a transaction. It's not the same kind of transaction selling a donkey, but there is an exchange of wealth when the woman joins this other household. So as such, this scenario is not a cultural anomaly. Any woman who gets married any marriage involves a transfer of wealth. But what's different here is that the young woman's status is an amma rather than a wife with social standing. It may be that due to the poverty of the woman's family, her father was unable to provide her with a dowry. So normally there's a transfer of wealth in both directions, and this time it only goes one way. In that case, the master shows generosity by his willingness to marry the young woman anyway, or arrange for her marriage to his son. The master gains no social standing or financial benefit by doing so, but agrees to provide a permanent home for her, which also provides financial relief to her family. He is their benefactor. Because the woman has married into the family, her home with them is permanent. She's not released after 6 years the way a male hired servant is. If something goes sour in her relationship with the master, either before or after they have sexual relations, he may not sell her as a slave. His only alternative to going through with the marriage is to persuade her to return home. The so-called bride price would ensure that her family could redeem her if she was mistreated. So if the master's original intent was for her to marry his son, then he must treat her as a daughter, not a slave. That means she's not available for sexual relations with him. These laws ensure that she is treated as a full-fledged family member, not a slave to be used. Whether she marries the master or his son, if her husband marries another woman, she cannot be discarded. These regulations, in fact, preserve her rights to food, clothing, and possibly sexual access to her husband. There's some question about how to translate the last sentence of it. In short, if she is troublesome, her family can ransom her. If he is troublesome, she can walk away. So female servants may become wives or concubines, but only as permanent members of the household. They cannot be traded around to other family members, discarded, or sold when their childbearing years have ended. To summarize then, the presumption in the case of the Amma is that she will marry either the master or his adult son. The Book of the Covenant makes no provision for a female household servant who is not connected by marriage to the household. Since sexual activity is presumed, marriage is required, and the normal 7th-year release is not permitted. In short, the laws protect a young woman from sexual exploitation at the hands of her new master. She's entitled to full marital rights with the master and/or a daughter-in-law's standing in the household. So on its own, just looking carefully and closely at these laws and trying to understand them, the humanitarian impulse is evident. However, we can make an even stronger case for the protective nature of these laws based on 2 additional factors. Each factor distances acceptable forms of Israelite servitude from the kind of exploitation the Israelites experienced in Egypt. So the first factor to consider is the literary structure of the Book of the Covenant, which is again, Exodus 21 to 23. And the second factor involves attention to genre and the wider context. So first, literary structure. This is a chiasm or literary sandwich identified by William Morrow. And you'll notice that I've put a box around the 2 sections that correspond to each other. First of all, the slave laws that we were just looking at. And they match, in this literary sandwich, they match the Sabbath patterns for land and work. So this chiastic placement signals that these laws are oriented toward freedom or Sabbath rather than toward slavery. That is, they do not encourage the acquisition of slaves. There's no mass slavery situation going on, but rather stipulate a limited term of service in the case of males and a permanent home in the case of females. So again, the point is not getting slaves. The point is limiting the authority of those who hire servants in order to pay off debts. A second factor that can help us to properly situate these commands is attention to genre and widening circles of context. So by definition, we're in a section of laws in Exodus known as casuistic laws. And by definition, casuistic law deals in the realm of non-ideal situations. If we focus just on one command on its own, we are likely to miss the wider vision of what God wants to accomplish. We should not imagine for a moment that God encourages the sale of daughters as concubines or of other Israelites as indentured servants. These laws regulate such practices to avoid exploitation of the vulnerable. As a solution for destitution, the practice of serving one's fellow Israelite is strictly regulated. So if we really want to understand these laws and how they would actually function, we need to read them in their wider context. So I carefully read through all the laws of the Book of the Covenant, Exodus 21 to 23, or 20 to 23, and here's what I found. Here are all of the factors in the immediate context which would further constrain this situation so that it's not exploitative. First of all, Yahweh brought them out of servitude, as I mentioned. So anything we see needs to be consistent with that. Servants and foreigners alike are allowed a Sabbath rest, and this includes children born to an Amah who is a permanent family member. They get to rest on the Sabbath too. It's not like all of the wealthy family members can rest and the servants have to work. Nope, everyone gets to rest. Kidnapping is strictly prohibited, thereby ending the slave trade before it can even start. The life of a servant is equal to that of a free citizen. The penalty for killing a servant is death. So there's a acknowledgement of human dignity. The application of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth principle of chapter 21, verse 24 to indentured servants is really quite fascinating. Permanent injury of a servant's eye or tooth by his master results in the servant's freedom. In other words, excessive force against your servants is not tolerated. If a master disciplines a servant so severely that he's unable to work for a time, the master is required to personally bear the loss of labor. He can't add it to his servant's bill, the debt that's being repaid. And in the case of a goring ox, servants are valued even more highly than free citizens. Their lives are taken just as seriously, and the master's loss of labor is also taken into account. So in other words, casual disregard of the life of anyone's Eved or Amah is strictly prohibited. Mistreatment of foreigners is prohibited. Therefore, any servitude that resembles Egypt is strictly out of bounds. Taking advantage of widow or fatherless is strictly prohibited. The acquisition of household servants must always be in the servant's best interests. What we don't see is somebody, standing there at the funeral, just ready to take, after a man dies, ready to take away his wife and children as his slaves. You can't take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. And the well-to-do may not charge interest on loans to the needy. They may not keep collateral such as a cloak overnight. So this policy effectively prevents perpetual indentured servitude through ever-increasing interest on unpaid debt, such as we might see in India today in brick factories, where families come to pay their debt, but the slave owner makes it so that no matter how hard they work, the debt is never paid. That's off limits for ancient Israel. Those in power may neither show favoritism to the poor in court nor deny them justice. And unplowed fields are to support the poor during the Sabbath year, preventing the conditions that led to servitude in the first place. So each of these laws in the Book of the Covenant ensures that indentured servitude is the exception rather than the rule, and that it's carried out humanely, preserving the human dignity of the servant. Esau McCulley advocates an even wider context for these laws. In his book, Reading While Black, African American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope, a book I highly recommend, McCulley considers Jesus' discussion with the Pharisees over the legitimacy of divorce. Jesus grounds the ideal of marriage, not in the laws at Sinai, but in God's creation design. The laws do not present an ideal world, but rather seek to mitigate against the effects of a broken world. In his words, not every passage of the Torah presents the ideal for human interactions. Instead, some passages accept the world as broken and attempt to limit the damage we do to one another. When we read these laws in light of the entire canon, we gain a wider vision. As Esau puts it, the Old Testament and later the New Testament create an imaginative world in which slavery becomes more and more untenable. Can we create that kind of world for our congregations and for our neighborhoods? Not only is it untenable in practice, but slavery has no place in God's future vision of a restored earth. The new heavens and new earth will be a place with no sorrow and no tears and no violence and no lack. A place where every human will fully realize their destiny as God's image and will live in harmony with everyone. As William Morrow concludes, the biblical slavery laws were calculated to make readers uneasy about the ethics of slave owning. These laws represent an early strategy for raising readers' conscience about the institution of slavery and implicitly calling it into question. Overall, their tactics reflect an ethic of concern for the vulnerable. Old Testament laws inform our ethics because these laws demonstrate how God works within our broken world to mitigate the effects of our brokenness. It doesn't take long, if you're looking at news websites and reading headlines, it doesn't take long to see that our world is broken and polarized and deeply divided. But we can see evidence in the law of God's care for the vulnerable and the limits he places on those in power. But the laws do not define God's ultimate ideal, for that will have to look elsewhere. Our vision must be rooted in God's creation design and fleshed out by the prophets of the Old and New Testaments, who see a future with good news for the poor and healing for the broken and freedom for the captives. For that world, we wait and work in hope. So I hope this has been helpful to you. As I wrestled with these texts in the wake of George Floyd's murder, I found once again, and this has happened to me so many times in my work as an Old Testament scholar, that when we take the texts that seem the hardest and we're willing to stare at them and we're willing to wrestle with them and we won't let them go until they bless us, there is a blessing in these texts for the church today. So I would love to hear your questions. This may have raised other things for you that you want to explore.
Carmen, thank you so much for sharing that. There's a lot to digest there. And I just want to remind our audience to, yes, please email us your questions to questions@regent-college.edu. I just want to open with one thing to start, and I think the word that kept coming to me as you were sort of going through those laws was the question of ownership, and that, you know, when I think of slavery, I always think of ownership and how you're owning another human being. And so the thing that came to mind was, is slavery and slavery laws even the right label to apply to these Old Testament covenantal passages?
Yeah, great question. And I don't think they are, for the reason you've just mentioned. These people are not owned. Male servants, you know, this is more like a contracted worker, somebody who said, I want to work off my debt because I don't have the wealth to pay for it. And so for the man, he's not owned. The woman is not owned in the sense that we think of owning slaves. She belongs to the household And there are, as I mentioned, there is the language of buying and selling being used there, but not in a way that's inconsistent with any other marriage relationship. We don't use the same language to describe marriage today, but I don't think that because our language is different. So yes, the institution of marriage was different than it is now, but I don't think the language itself is the only clue to that. We often use metaphorical language that doesn't reflect exactly how we precisely feel about something.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I think that was the thing for me. I just thought, you had mentioned in our earlier conversations that slavery and the existence of sort of these types of laws are often a reason that people dispense of their faith.
Yes.
And I almost wonder if we could apply more appropriate terms, and also
Yes.
that super important framing to see, like, God is not saying, do this because it's the ideal. God is saying, okay, if in this broken, fallen, outside of Eden world, then do it this way.
Yes.
So yeah,
I
thank you
think
for that.
translation matters so much, and I don't think the word slavery is helpful here. I think it distorts what's actually going on. And even the NIV has servants. If you buy a Hebrew servant, I think I would say if you hire a male, maybe servant, but not buy, because buying implies that the man is now owned by the master, and he isn't. This is a limited term of service. So the word buy is misleading in English.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have a question here from Gustavo, and he writes this. He says, you mentioned that Israel should not replicate the experience in Egypt. Could you expand on what the main elements are that characterize those different experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm beginning work on a commentary on Exodus for Baker Academic. And mainly I've just done the first 3 chapters so far. And so I've been looking at Israelite slavery in Egypt. And I was a little surprised to learn that the Israelites were not the only ones whose labor belonged to Pharaoh. Actually, every Egyptian had to work for Pharaoh anytime he said jump, they had to jump. And this is actually, it seems to be a result of the policies that Joseph put in place in order to save them from famine. So remember Pharaoh's dream about the 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, and Joseph's administrative genius is to collect massive taxes during the 7 years of plenty and then to dole out that food to people during the 7 years of famine. And what's fascinating and troubling about that is that what Joseph proposed as a solution to save the nation actually became the tools of oppression for the next generation or the generations that followed, because when someone else got in power and he didn't remember Joseph and his heart to save people from famine, the fact that Pharaoh had bought up all the land in Egypt in exchange for this grain, doling out grain, meant that he owned everything and everyone had to do what he said. What struck me as I read Exodus chapter 1 carefully is the disgust that the Egyptians felt towards the Hebrews. So although everyone had to work for Pharaoh, the Hebrews were hated and despised by the Egyptians. And so it was that that situation of generalized servitude combined with racism that produced the kind of slavery that we see, that didn't even see them as people anymore. We have clues in Exodus chapter 1 that Pharaoh doesn't see them as people. They're teeming like insects in his mind and undermining him. So I think the striking difference that I see in the laws at Sinai is that every person, no matter their origin, no matter their age, no matter their gender, is a person with dignity and to be treated with dignity. Everyone's life matters. So if you kill a slave, it's a death penalty, just like if you kill a free person. And again, I just used the word slave and shouldn't have. If you kill a hired servant, the penalty is not less than if you kill someone who's wealthy. So to me, that's the biggest difference. And the other difference is that this is always temporary in the case of male servants, whereas in Egypt there was no hope of ever not having to work for Pharaoh because he owned everything, even the land.
Just in follow-up to that, Carmen, how did Israel do? I mean, they came out of Egypt, the Exodus,
Hmm.
amazing, phenomenal act in their lives, but they
Hmm.
grumbled pretty quick after.
They
So I'm
did.
curious, how did they do with their own treatment of servitude and slavery in
Yeah,
their
yeah,
society?
that's a great question. And we don't have to turn very many pages past the book of Deuteronomy to find things going off the rails. So while God institutes laws that are meant to create a society in which everyone can flourish and poverty is temporary and people have homes and people have land to work, that's not the way it works out long term. And so you have, like the case of Solomon, who builds an ever bigger empire, and though he starts out wise, ends up forcing people into labor to prop up his empire. And now he's got to have lots and lots of food to feed all the people in his court because he's so wealthy. And so it becomes like a snowball rolling down a hill. And Israel does begin to mimic the oppressive policies of nations around them. And so that's troubling. The law doesn't fix the human heart. It lays out it sets up boundaries that if we live within these boundaries, we truly could have a flourishing society. I don't think the law itself is bad. The law is good, but people's hard hearts turn any opportunity into a tool of oppression.
Mm, thank you. Yeah, I have a couple of questions here that dig into some of the gender issues that you
Okay.
highlighted. So I'm just going to read one just straight out from the email because
Okay.
I think it provides a better context. So my question is about women, sex, and marriage.
Mm.
You said that because sex is implied, the woman had to be treated as though she were married. And this person wonders if it makes more sense to say that sex marries people in the biblical witness,
Hmm.
and therefore she is treated as a spouse because sex is implied.
Hmm.
And the writer acknowledges that sort of just grammatically messing around with the sentence structure. But his point is
Hmm.
more on the relationship and the implications of sex as a marriage act, and thus an act that requires the consequential implications of a covenant of marriage.
Yeah, so this is a question, a very good question. And students will often ask me, like, is marriage like, okay, we try to tell our teenagers sex outside of marriage is a bad idea. The Bible prohibits it, but like, what even is marriage in the ancient world? Like, if you like, did Adam and Eve were they married? Like, I didn't see a ceremony, right? And so we have to acknowledge that this ceremony by which two people were joined in the ancient world is different than it is today. Much less about a white dress and a lot of people, and more actually about the joining of two families. So I don't think it's the case that sex implies marriage. I don't think we can just say, if you have sex, then you're married, because there are laws that prohibit having sex without being married, because it's a violation of the two families' trust. When two people get married, it's not just like they decide they want to be together. It's the linking of two family lines, which affects everybody in the family. So it's not a decision that's entered into lightly. But I do find it interesting that verse 10 says, if he takes another wife for himself, he may not reduce her food, clothing, or marital rights. And I take that last phrase to mean that the woman has sexual access to her husband, because in that day, for her to have no children would have been a severe social stigma, and she wouldn't have had anyone to care for her in her old age. And so if he doesn't like her, that doesn't mean he can't provide children for her. He still has to treat her with that kind of dignity. We think sometimes in our culture that men are the ones who want sex and women just put up with it. Well, no, in the ancient world, it's very clear that, read the story of Jacob and his two wives. Rachel and Leah barter with each other for sexual access to their husband, because having that access ensures offspring, which then elevates their social standing. So I'm not sure if I totally addressed the whole question. There were a couple of parts to it.
Yeah. I can't speak for the writer of the question, but I think you hit on a number of them. Connected with that is a question from Mike about verse 4. So does verse 4 imply that there was a female ebed that was given to the male ebed? Or no, I guess it would be a female amma given to the male ebed?
Yeah.
And thus the reason why she could not leave with her husband when he was done, was that because she had her own debt to pay still?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's not something I spent a lot of time diving into, but I think that's a good possibility. If the master provides a wife for the male servant and she bears him children, they belong to the master's household. Perhaps they're paying off a debt. Um, yeah, this is a bit of a fuzzy area, though. I'm not sure because, and back to the previous question, this relates to another thing I wanted to say, and that is there doesn't seem to be in Exodus a possibility of a woman becoming an indentured servant to pay off a debt. Like marriage is always part of it. And one thing I think that's just really beautiful about that is the way that it would protect women from, if a woman is poor and she wants to pay off her debt and she goes and works in this household, who's to say that she's going to be protected and not taken advantage of? And in fact, God prevents that from happening by saying, no, if you're going to come into the household and work, you need to do so as a permanent member of the household, which means they are going to take the responsibility of protecting you. Like you belong to them now in the sense that they're going to look out for you. They can't just use and abuse you and then send you away.
You know what that makes me think of? Here in Canada, one of the blights, I would say, and a hidden blight is how we have these immigration packages, particularly with countries like the Philippines, to bring in care workers to come and work in the home. And so we provide this immigration status, but so many of those women are abused, not like, emotionally, sometimes physically, and certainly sexually. And we haven't provided provision for the proper treatment.
Yes.
And they're not coming as servants. They are driven by poverty, but of a different sort. And it just makes me think about how actually our God has something to say about that.
Yes, I love that. We lived in the Philippines for 2.5 years, so we saw it on the other end. Children growing up with mom overseas working as a nanny or as a healthcare worker in another country and sending money home for the family, but in many cases, raising someone else's kids and not able to be there to raise her own kids. And this was an act of desperation. It was a way of providing for the family, but it's not enough. The pay is not enough for the whole family to come.
No,
so
and we have to think about that. Yeah, I think as Christians, the application, I think in the midst of all of the political upheaval in the States, I've heard so many Christians say, well, Jesus was not political. And I don't know how we can talk about our faith not being political when we see here an entire structure given for how to live well, even amidst the fall.
Yes.
So that's very instructive to how we engage with the many and various issues of our time.
Yes. And so that structure that we get at Sinai is not a template to then implement in our modern day society. I think a lot of Christians would love to see the United States or Canada become more biblical, more biblically grounded, or have more biblical laws. But Sinai doesn't provide a template for that. We're in a different kind of scenario, but it can inform our ethics, and it should inform the way we think about who's in charge and how is their power being restrained? Because that's the thing I see over and over again in these laws is the restraining of power. If you read Exodus 20, which is the 10 Commandments, if you slow down and read it carefully, you'll notice that it seems to be addressed to adult landowning Israelite males. Like you're not coveting your neighbor's wife. It doesn't say you shall not covet your neighbor's husband. Like it's addressed, the default audience is a man who owns property, who's married, and it's over and over again restraining his power. He needs to let his household rest on the Sabbath. He is not allowed to speak ill of someone else and ruin their reputation. He's not allowed to take a wife that belongs to someone else, or even to lust after her. There's so many ways that it restrains his power. So I think the law is actually good for the oppressed. I think the law, if we if we lived by these principles, we would not be able to become oppressors.
That's profound. That's such a profound statement. Yeah. And I think the other, you're highlighting the issues of really money, sex, and power that we read in the Decalogue and the Ten Commandments. Then I immediately connect that, of course, to the description of Jesus in Philippians 2, that emptying of power in order to come and be and to minister and to love.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so
Beautiful.
much. We've got a few more questions. People are totally loving this. So a couple of them are going back to our earlier discussion around sort of English Bible translations.
Okay.
You're working on a bunch of study Bibles. Do you see that things will be updated to try to help clarify that? And then a related question is, when did we get lost in translation over the word slavery anyways? Was that partially because of the transatlantic slave trade, and what happened there?
Those are great questions. So the work that I'm doing for study Bibles does not involve any tampering with the text itself. So I'm writing study notes for the CSB, for the NLT, and for the NIV, either Genesis and Exodus, and the whole Pentateuch, depending on the project. But we don't have the opportunity to change the biblical text, just add notes. And yet I'm trying to focus my notes on areas where English readers are misled or get confused. One thing that I think is true about language is that it changes. The English language changes over time. And so one of the things that I think we need to look for when we choose an English translation to read and to make it our main translation is who translated this? Like, what kind of committee was part of it? First of all, you want a committee, not an individual. The more the merrier. And is that committee made up of a broad range of denominational backgrounds, different genders, different ethnicities? Because each of us, coming from our own social location, notice different things about the text and have sensitivities to other things. And so I think it's very problematic when a translation committee is made up of all people who have come from the same subculture and who share the same gender and maybe the same level of education. And that's true of the ESV. The ESV was an all-male translation committee by design, and all of them, I believe, were white, although I haven't looked at the list lately. The other thing I look for is this committee working in an ongoing way to continue to revise the text as needed, as the language changes. And so the NIV is what I use in class. It's not a perfect translation. I sometimes will make corrections with my students or say, there's another way of looking at this. But what I love about the NIV is that their Committee on Bible Translation meets every summer for, I think, 2 weeks to work on improving places where the text is fuzzy or is not communicating well in our cultural moment as language shifts. And so the edition they released in 2011 is 5% different than the 1984 version. And many of the changes they made are for these reasons, to take things that were misleading and clarify them. So I have a lot of hope that there's a lot of good scholarship going into it. The Committee on Bible Translation is a diverse group from lots of different denominations. There's men and women on the committee. And so that gives me hope that it communicates well. It's not the only translation I use. I encourage students to look at multiple translations if we're reading in English. But yeah.
Well, I was a Regent student in the era, the end of the era of Dr. Gordon Fee, of course, who was key on that NIV translation committee. And
yes.
As a welcome gift to all of us students, the year that I started, we all received a copy of the new NIV, New Testament, and then the Old Testament came out a few years later. So I remember how ripe and contentious those conversations can be.
I've had a target on my chest on more than one occasion.
I'm sure you have. I'm sure.
Speaking of politics, there's a lot of politics behind the scenes in Bible translation that the average reader doesn't realize. And part of it is copyright issues with different publishers. And part of it is the theological commitments of a translation committee. So, for example, the ESV acquired the rights to the RSV, which was the basis for the new Revised Standard Version. So then the RSV wasn't being published anymore. They acquired those rights, and their intention was to revise it towards complementarian theology. And yet I know of many people who would not claim to be or call themselves complementarians, who gravitate towards the ESV as their translation because they think it's more reliable, not realizing there's actually there's a perspective here that's being portrayed. And that's why I think it's important to have a committee that has a breadth of theological perspectives.
I'm quite surprised to hear that. Having just recently purchased an ESV as a gift, but it does, yeah, thank you. I mean, generally speaking, I totally agree with you in terms of reading translations widely, and it's something that I'm definitely pro. But thank you for that. That was really helpful. Got a couple more questions. We've got just under 10 minutes, so I hope you're got a little more fuel in the tank.
Sure.
So this one came in, and it says, in the covenant code, there seems to be a hierarchy in which lives take precedence over material loss. For example, Exodus 22, 1-3.
Yes.
Is this precedence clearly there? And how do you see this speaking to our current cultural context?
Yes. Oh, what a wonderful question. I love it. It is true when you read the biblical laws carefully, not just in the covenant code, but in Leviticus and Deuteronomy as well. There is never the death penalty is never given for property crimes. If someone steals a sheep, you are not allowed to pull out your gun and shoot them. Stealing of a sheep means they need to give you 4 sheep back. There's never a death penalty for stealing, or for even for injury. If someone injures someone else, it's an eye for an eye, not a life for an eye. Like, not if you maim me, if you cut off my hand, I'm going to kill you. There's an eye for an eye is meant to constrain people's revenge. It's meant to make sure that things don't spiral out of control. And this, I think, is a really important word for our cultural moment, because in the example of the death of George Floyd was being picked up for a minor potential minor petty crime. He hadn't gone to trial, right? He hadn't had a chance to even defend himself, but there is no possible way that the death penalty would be appropriate in that case. The death penalty is only appropriate in a case of manslaughter, or like in the case of like outright rebellion or adultery in a way that unravels the order of society for ancient Israel. So for property crimes, I mean, in the United States, there seems to be this idea like, if you step foot on my property, then I have a right to pull out my gun on you. And I just feel like that's really problematic. And it's problematic for our police to be using that kind of a kind of force that could kill someone in response to nonviolent, unarmed crime involving, property destruction or theft of some kind.
Yeah, and it really feels like, the notion of an eye for an eye is about a proportional response.
Yes.
And then again, you go New Testament and it's a disproportional response, but in the other direction. We're looking for a response that is profoundly full of grace.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you for that. And just one last question here. This is from Johnny. He says, what do you think about what do you think about Isaiah's oracle regarding the mission of the servant of Yahweh in chapter 42, particularly verse 4, and how Matthew references this passage? And I have not looked those up myself, so you may need a moment to do that.
Yeah, let me see how that might tie in here. So it was Isaiah 42, verse 4?
Yes.
Okay, so it says, he will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his teaching, the islands will put their hope. So I assume that this is being asked because it's the servant of the Lord, and we're looking at servant laws maybe in Exodus.
would possibly be my guess, but also the question of how Matthew references that
Yes. And
passage. So
what's the reference in Matthew?
I don't have that one on. That didn't come in the question, and in trying to engage you well in
Well,
conversation, I haven't looked it up.
I'm smart, but I don't have that memorized.
Yeah, I do think there is that use of the servant language in Isaiah,
Mhm.
and how that ties in to all of our exploration of servitude and slavery in general.
Yes, well, it ties in. The servant of the Lord in Isaiah does tie in with the servant language in Exodus, because as I mentioned, Israel's serving Pharaoh and they're brought out in order to serve Yahweh. And in the book of Isaiah, the servant figure is a really interesting figure, because depending on which servant text you're reading, it either seems to be talking about the community of faith as a whole, like the entire nation of Israel is God's servant, or an individual who's then the servant of God trying to restore the nation. And so it seems to me that what we have with Jesus is that he comes as the servant of God to be and do what Israel failed to be and do, and to restore them to right relationship with God. I can tie that back into this idea of bearing God's name. At Sinai, God put his name on the Israelites so that they would be his representatives among the nations. But as we already talked about, that doesn't go so well in every age. And there are many ways that the Israelites fail to keep the covenant and they fail to represent God well. And so when Jesus comes on the scene, he is actually leaning fully into that vocation as someone who represents God. And it's clear that he is the one who is establishing justice on the earth. That he is that role of servant is not just a pie in the sky kind of vision. It's not just about knowing where you're going to go when you die, but it is about living well on earth and establishing justice. So I see in the laws and in the prophetic vision a very practical set of practices that we're supposed to lean into as the people of God, that our faith actually makes a difference in the public square. Our faith needs to make a difference in politics. I think we need to think carefully about how that plays out. Too many Christians today have hitched their political wagon to a particular candidate rather than to kingdom values at large. And if that's a topic of interest, I've written on it a couple times over the past month. You can check out my blog.
Dr. Carmen Joy Imes, an incredible hour together. Thank you so much. This is where I miss the live audience, where we could jump up and embrace but thank you so much for sharing really your heart and how Scripture has carried you through the turmoil of these past few months, and particularly in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. We are deeply grateful to you. Thank you to our live stream audience at home who have tuned in and who have engaged so deeply and meaningfully.
Great questions.
Yeah, fantastic questions. We'll close off with a couple more announcements. Reading the Bible right now, as I said at the beginning, is a new mini lecture series for us. We have a few more planned for this semester. We also are continuing with our Ideas That Matter lecture series, which is connecting with the most pressing issues of our time from a theological standpoint. We also continue our Interface lecture series, which is about the relationship between science and faith. And finally, a new series called Human Flourishing in a Technological Age. And you can find all of those lecture series and events and more on the Regent College events calendar at regent-college.edu. You can also join me, Christina, again next Thursday at the same time, lunch hour Pacific time, for a book launch with Tish Harrison Warren on her new book called, her new book is called Prayer in the Night, and it is wonderful. So yes, many free events happening through Regent College, all available online. Please do check them come out. And I'm sure you're as stimulated as I am from Carmen's talk today. And if you want to study more with her, which I'm sure you do, you can join her for a course on the book of Exodus this summer at Regent College. The course descriptions are available as well on our website, and registration will open in the next month or so. Finally, a huge thank you to the Regent College bookstore and Regent Audio, who help us host these free lectures and offer them to you as part of our love and passion for the equipping of the church. So if you have a spare moment, please do go over to Regent Audio and to the Regent College bookstore online. If you're in Vancouver, you can pop into the bookstore in person and give them your support, because they are doing so much to support the church. So again, Carmen, it has been an absolute pleasure, and to our audience, thank you.
Thank you.